Perfect. Okay, now y'all can go back to whatever. You can take your video off if you'd like. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Alaina DeBiasi. She's been gracious enough to do this program from um, where she's located, which I think is in, are you in Detroit? Yes, Detroit. Wonderful. So Dr. Alaina DiBiase is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Wayne State University. Her research interests include understanding the causes and consequences of firearm violence, leveraging law enforcement data systems to advance gun. I don't know why I can't talk today. To advance crime gun intelligence, evaluating the effectiveness of violence prevention initiatives, conducting community engaged research, and exploring the geography of crime. Through her work, she seeks to develop new and better policies and practices aimed at violence prevention. Well, I'm excited about presenting you today. So if you have anything else you'd want to tell us about concerning your background, please do so. And I'd like everybody to remain muted. If you're not muted already, which I think there's a couple, I'm going to mute you. And at the end, we will have questions. At that time, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Alaina DiBiase.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen, so let me get that rolling. And let's see here. Is everyone able to see my PowerPoint slide?
Yes, it's up
Yes.
on the
Okay, perfect. And if for any reason throughout the presentation, if you can't, I'm going to be sharing some videos, and if the audio doesn't come through, please somebody let me know if there's any challenges. But thank you for the introduction, and it's really an honor to be here presenting with you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so virtually. It is very, very cold out there, so thank you for that. So, as Anna mentioned, I partner closely with law enforcement agencies, both locally in Detroit and nationally, to design and implement and evaluate violence prevention initiatives. More broadly, I leverage law enforcement data systems to advance evidence-based and intelligence-led policing practices that make communities safer. So again, thanks for the opportunity to talk. And today I'm going to be highlighting the value of something called crime gun intelligence and its use by the Detroit Police Department as both a tactical and strategic tool. So I'm going to be covering a lot of ground and covering a lot of topics. So as Anna mentioned, I'm going to save some time at the end for a bunch of questions. So Detroit, Michigan has long carried a reputation as one of the most violent cities in the United States. Yet it does tend to have a history of reinvention, and another renaissance, I think, is taking place, one that is marked by an increasing emphasis on evidence-based strategies to improve public safety. So some of you might be aware that Chief Todd Bedison there was a press conference earlier this month, and he reported on some really important crime statistics for the city of Detroit. So for the calendar year 2025, so just last year, the city recorded 165 homicides. And this is the first time in nearly 60 years that homicide cases, has fallen below 200. So it's pretty remarkable. This historic reduction also coincides with an overall 10% reduction in violent crime. So the figure I'm showing here, so this presentation is recorded, and I'm happy also to share my slides because I recognize some of this font might be very tiny, so you can always go back and look at these slides. But the figure shown here captures the homicide rate going back to 1985 up through 2025. So just focusing on that 2025 and 2024 figures, in 2025, so just last year, the homicide rate in Detroit was about 26 homicides per 100,000 people. Now in 2024, the year earlier, it was about 32 homicides per 100,000 people. So that's a 23% reduction in the rate, which is pretty remarkable. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, how does Detroit measure up to the state of Michigan or even to, the United States as a whole? So as you can see here, there is some progress to be had. It's the homicide rate in Detroit is about 6 times larger than the state of Michigan and about 8 times larger than the rate for the United States. Now, historically, Detroit is, typically in the top five most violent cities in the United States. However, it's starting to slip from that top five ranking. While things kind of oscillate, those top positions are now being held by cities like New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, Baltimore, and Washington. But Detroit, don't get me wrong, is still within the top 10 most violent cities in the United States. And that's not to that's not to downplay the reductions we're seeing and the great work that's being there. It's just, being realistic here that we do have some progress to be had. But against this backdrop, this violent crime backdrop that we were seeing in Detroit recently, the Detroit Police Department has implemented a range of strategies aimed at curbing violence, and among these efforts is the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center, or CGIC for short. So remember that CGIC phrase because it's a mouthful to say Crime Gun Intelligence Center all the time. So I'll be using the phrase CGIC. And this represents, the Detroit CGIC represents one of the department's most evidence-based models, meaning that there's a host of research and support lending to the value of this Detroit CGIC in reducing crime. And that's not, we can't often say that for a lot of strategies. So the CGIC became fully operational in January 2020, and this is on part because the city of Detroit received a major grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance to get things going, to get the ball rolling. And really, the Detroit CGIC has brought crime gun intelligence to the forefront of strategies aimed at incapacitating violent gun
Okay, I think
offenders
we're going to
and
start.
reducing gun violence through
So I would
proactive
like to
enforcement
welcome everyone
initiatives.
to the
And I
Stock
know I
Club
just said a
program
whole
on
bunch
Zoom
there,
today.
but let's
It
kind of
was
unpack what I
advantageous
just
for us
said in
because
the
it is a
next
snow
couple
day in South
slides.
Haven. So
So
schools are
starting
closed, which
off
means
like with the
Scott Club is
very basic
closed, but we're
fundamental
here on Zoom
question,
and we're
which
going to do
is
this every
what is
January. I
crime
think it
gun
works out well for
intelligence?
us.
So
Um,
crime gun
a
intelligence
couple
is the
quick things.
systematic
Our
collection,
programs are
analysis, and
sponsored in
use
part
of
by
firearm-related data
through
to
June by the
support
South Haven
real-time
Rotary
and strategic
through a grant that was
decision-making,
given to us in
helping
memory
law
of Carol
enforcement
Hodgman.
intervene
So we'll
earlier and to prevent
everybody know that
future gun
they're
violence. So
our
some of you might be
sponsor.
thinking, what do you mean
Our
by
next program is
firearm-related
February 3rd.
data?
Now,
We'll hold
because
on to that
Scott Club
thought
is
because we're going to
under
get there.
construction for
But
our
before we do,
lift
let's first
elevator,
define
like
what
an
we
elevator.
mean by
That's a
crime
historic
gun
project
in
for
the
us
term crime gun
that
intelligence.
we will meet
So a
for the
crime
next
gun
few
is a firearm
couple months
recovered by
at the
law
First
enforcement
Congregational
that is
Church
illegally
across the street.
possessed,
So the next couple
used in a
programs,
crime,
please stay
or
tuned
suspected
to
by
the
law enforcement
newsletter. Yeah,
officials of
if you
having
got your
been used in a
email, you'll get a
crime. So
newsletter.
these are not
We'll
just your
update you then
standard guns.
about if
These
anything
guns
comes
have
up,
criminal
but it'll be
histories,
at
and
one
that's why we
o'clock.
call them
There
crime
won't be a
guns.
Zoom for that one. The
So in
Zoom
relation to
requires
the
internet
firearm-related
and,
data, here's where I'm going to
just to
elaborate a bit
not
more on
complicate
that.
things, there won't be
So
a
at the
Zoom.
core of Detroit's
The
crime gun
Black History
intelligence-driven
Leadership Society
approach
is
is
going
a
to give
very
us, I
simple
guarantee
but
you, a great
powerful
program.
idea,
This
and that
year
is
is the
that
Center of
firearms
Black History
involved in the commission of
commemorations.
crime, often referred
And
to as
of
crime
course,
guns, they
for this
leave
program,
behind
we're going to do a
trails, and
survey
some of these
afterwards. So I
trails are
have your
more
email.
obvious
Expect a
than
survey in the
others.
next day or
So
so.
through
That
investments
helps
made
us
in the people,
certainly with the
processes,
grant
and
process, but
technologies
also
that
gives us a
underpin
window
crime gun
to how
intelligence
well we're
capacity,
doing as far
these
as
trails can be
programming and what
revealed to
we're bringing
provide
to you.
actionable intelligence
Okay,
with
I
real
think that I
tactical
have
and strategic
everything. And
impact.
real quick,
So I'll
I
unpack what I
have
mean by
a
tactical and
request from
strategic
Carol
impact
Quincy.
in a while.
She would like to do a
But
screenshot.
first, there are
We've
two
done this
federal
before. She's
systems
done it for
that
book
are
club, but it's
critical
kind of
to this
fun to have
endeavor. And this is where we're
everybody
getting that
in a picture.
firearm-related
And this
intelligence,
is what
that
we use to
firearm-related
update
data
our
from.
membership
The
to
first
show.
is the
So if you could
firearms tracing
bring
system, and
your
the second is the
if you'd
National
like, your
Integrated
faces
Ballistic
on the
Information Network,
screen,
or NIBIN. So
and
I'll be
then we can do
saying
a quick
NIBIN a lot.
screenshot,
So
and I
make
will
sure,
leave you alone.
remember that it stands for the National
Okay,
Integrated Ballistic
and
Information Network.
here's
And both of
patients.
these
Thank you
systems
for those
are
whose
managed by the
faces we're
Bureau of
seeing.
Alcohol, Tobacco,
Anybody
Firearms,
else?
Explosives,
Great.
We've got
or
Megan.
ATF.
Wonderful. Okay.
So I'll be spending a lot of
Judy,
my time talking
thanks.
about NIBIN.
Three's
Let's first
on.
talk about the
Wonderful.
Okay.
firearms tracing
Okay,
system to
so
kind of just
I'll
get it
count
out of
to
the way.
three,
Not that it's not
Okay.
valuable,
and
but
then
it's not the
everybody will
focus of this
smile, and Carol will
presentation
take
so
a
much.
screenshot,
So
and
when a
then we're good.
firearm is recovered from a
Okay,
crime scene,
1,
the law enforcement
2,
officer can take that
3.
firearm and complete an online a form called a firearms tracing form, or an
Okay.
e-trace form.
Okay.
And this form goes to ATF, and it's asking for a variety of information about that recovered crime gun, such as the make, model, and serial number. And in most cases, most firearms have most firearms have make, model, and serial number, but some of them actually don't have a serial number, which is a whole other host of problems, which perhaps I'll be invited back and I can talk about those those problems in the next presentation. But with that information, the ATF can start a little mini investigation. And, for the most part, if things go according to plan, they're able to trace that firearm back to its firearm manufacturer or importer. And from there, that leads them to the original federal firearms licensee. So that is the location, the organization, the business that
Okay, I think we're going
bought
to
that
start.
firearm to sell into
So
commerce.
would like
So
to
that could
welcome
be
everyone
Dick's
to the
Sporting
Scott
Goods, for
Club
example.
program on Zoom
So ATF
today.
reaches out to that
It was
FFL and says,
advantageous for
hey,
us because it is a snow day in
there
South
was
Haven.
a recovered
So
crime
schools are
gun.
closed, which
We
means
want to
Scott Club
know
is
who was the
closed, but
first, who
we're
purchased
here on
this
Zoom
firearm
and
from you.
we're going to do this
Well,
every
the
January.
FFL
I
is
think works
required
out
by
well for
law
us.
to keep these
Um,
records, to keep
a
these firearm
couple
records
quick
of the folks
things.
they sell
Our
firearms to.
programs
And so they look
are
through the records and they
sponsored in
match
part
up the
by
make, model, and serial
this
number to the
through
records they have
June
in
by the
file.
South Haven
And then
Rotary
all this
through a
information
grant
goes
that
back
was
into a
given to us in
firearms
memory
trace
of Carol
report and
Hodgman.
is given
So I
to
want
the law
everybody
enforcement
knows that
officer who first,
they're a
started
sponsor.
this process. So
Um,
there's
our
in
next
this report,
program
there's
is
a lot of
February
really
3rd.
valuable
Now, because
information.
Scott Club is
As you can
under
imagine,
construction
if
for
we're
our
able to identify the
lift
person who
elevator,
most
like an
recently
elevator,
purchased the firearm,
that's a
not to
historic
say that
project
they're
for
the
us
one who was involved in
that
the commission
we will
of the
meet
particular
for the next
crime,
few
but at least it's a
couple
good place
months
to
at the First
start
Congregational
from.
Church
It's a good place for
across the street. So
investigators
the
to
next
go
couple
and say, let's
programs,
interview this
please stay
person. Maybe
tuned
they
to
sold
a
the firearm,
newsletter.
maybe they
If
had,
you got your
the
email,
firearm
you'll get a
stolen from
newsletter.
them.
We'll
And so it's a
update
good
you
place to
then
start.
about if
But we're
anything comes
also
up,
able
but it'll
to
be at 1 o'clock.
um,
There won't be a
create
Zoom
a
for that one.
metric that is
Zoom
really
requires
important to
internet
identify
and,
something called firearms
just to
trafficking.
not
And that
complicate
metric is
things, there
called
won't be a
time to
Zoom.
crime. Some of you might
The
have heard
Black
of that
History Leadership
phrase.
Society
But
is
let's
going to
first
give
talk
us,
about
I
what
guarantee
firearms
you, a great
trafficking
program.
is. So
This year is
firearms
a Century of
trafficking
Black
refers
History
to the illegal
commemorations.
diversion, transfer, or
And
movement
of
of
course,
firearms from the
for this
lawful
program, we're going to
market
do a survey
into
afterwards. So
illegal
I have your
possession
email.
or
Expect a survey
use,
in the next day or
typically with
so.
the intent to
That helps
supply
us
individuals who are
certainly with the grant
prohibited from
process, but
possessing
also gives
firearms
us a
or to
window to
facilitate
how
criminal
well we're
activity.
doing as far as
So time to
programming and what
crime
we're bringing to
refers to
you.
the elapsed
Okay,
time
I think
between
that
a
I have
firearm's first
everything.
retail
And real
sale
quick,
and its
I
subsequent
have
recovery by
a
law
request from
enforcement
Carol
in
Quincy.
connection with the
She would
crime,
like to do a
which is
screenshot.
often the only
We've done this
known use
before.
of a
She's done it
firearm
for
in
book
criminal
club, but it's kind of
activity.
fun to have
Now, if we had
everybody
earlier
on a picture.
information on
And this is what we use to
firearms
update
criminal
our
use,
membership
such
to show.
as
So if you could
if it
bring
when it was discharged in a crime, when the
if
gun
you'd
went
like,
bang,
your
then we'd
faces
probably want to
on
use
the
that date
screen,
instead,
and then we
instead
can do a
of when the
quick
firearm was
screenshot, and then I
recovered.
will
But
leave you
alas,
alone.
oftentimes we don't have that information. But hold on
Okay,
to that idea
and
because we're going to be returning to
here's
that idea
patience.
later in
Thank
the
you for those
presentation.
whose faces we're
The key
seeing.
here is
Anybody
that
else?
if a
Great.
firearm
We've
is
got
purchased
Megan.
and then
Wonderful.
quickly ends up in
Okay.
crime, quickly it ends up
Judy,
recovered,
thanks.
then
Judy's
it's
on.
likely been
Wonderful.
Okay.
trafficked. And so the
Okay, so
ATF
I'll
has
count to
two kind of
3,
benchmarks
Okay.
and then
that
everybody will
gives them an
smile, and Carol will
indication
take
if
a
that firearm was
screenshot, and then we're
trafficked.
good.
So in calculating time to
Okay,
crime, if that
1,
number of days
2,
is under 3
3.
years, that's we might want to investigate that to see if that firearm it has been trafficked or is used in a trafficking network. But if that time to crime is under 1 year, that is a major red flag that that firearm was diverted from legal commerce to be used in a firearm trafficking scenario. So the example shown here, we have the first retail sale date, we have the date that it was recovered, the firearm was recovered by law enforcement. We calculate the number of days elapsed between those two dates, and it ends up coming out to somewhere a little under 1.84 years. So if I was ATF or the Detroit Police Department, and for this particular firearm, and I made this calculation and I saw that the time to crime was under 2 years, I might want to look further into this case to see if this involves firearms trafficking. In contrast, though, so with firearm tracing, you need to have the firearm. The firearm has to be recovered in order to get all this really great information to advance cases and shut down firearm trafficking rings. So the key here being the firearm needs to be recovered in order to fully leverage the power of this firearm tracing system. But that's not the case with NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. So the utility of NIBIN, it's not dependent on recovered crime guns. The gun does not need to be recovered. And that's what makes it such a powerful and broadly applicable tool for advancing public safety. Rather, cartridge cases collected from crime scenes, as well as test fires from recovered crime guns, can be processed through NIBIN, serving as breadcrumbs that connect events involving the same crime gun. And these connected events, these links, are known as NIBIN leads. So to kind of circle back a little bit to something I earlier said, when a firearm is discharged, most firearms, with some exceptions I'll get to later, leave behind a cartridge case. So the gun goes bang, the cartridge case falls on the ground on the crime scene. So those can be collected and entered into NIBIN. Now, if the firearm is actually there, if the crime gun is recovered on scene, officers will take that recovered crime gun and test fire it in a lab and then collect those cartridge cases, and those can be entered into NIBIN. So, in the field, what we like to refer to as the crime scene evidence, we just call cartridge cases. And the test fired cartridge cases, we often just refer to as test fires. But I just want to make sure that you know the distinction between the two. But nevertheless, we don't have to have the firearm recovered to fully use the NIBIN system. We just need those cartridge cases collected from the crime scene. And again, we can, through NIBIN, we can connect these crime scenes together by virtue of the same firearm being used, and we call those NIBIN leads. But let's kind of like dig a little bit deeper into the NIBIN system and what it actually is and what it does. So NIBIN is the system and process used to collect, analyze, and share intelligence gained from ballistic evidence. So here's how it works in a nutshell. When firearms are discharged, they leave unique fingerprints on cartridge cases. And these cartridge cases can be collected at crime scenes or from test fires from recovered crime guns that I just talked about. So using a NIBIN acquisition station, this is a literal, physical station here that's equipped with all sorts of high resolution 3D cameras. Well, we're using those cameras to take pictures of those unique fingerprints on the cartridge cases, and that information is then digitized and in a separate system is cross-correlated against other entries that were previously entered into NIBIN and to potentially find matches. When the system finds these high confidence correlations or these matches, these are reviewed by a trained NIBIN technician, and once confirmed, they're called NIBIN leads. So those are those connections between crime scenes by virtue of the same firearm being used. So a NIBIN lead connects at least two pieces of ballistic evidence from separate criminal incidents, indicating that the same firearm was likely used in each event. So these leads are really, really powerful, as you can imagine. They allow agencies to connect shootings that might otherwise look unrelated, helping investigators to identify shooters, disrupt cycles of violence, and focus investigative resources where they matter the most. Now, while NIBIN is a powerful tool, it's important to understand that not all firearms are eligible for entry into NIBIN. So what doesn't get entered? Well, pieces of ballistic evidence from firearms that are typically not entered into NIBIN include revolvers, well, for the obvious reason being that there are no cartridge cases associated with revolvers, single shot or bolt action rifles, shotguns and gauges other than 12 gauge, weapons that have never been fired, and firearms that are unsafe, inoperable, or incomplete. But having said all that, we know through research that most firearms used in crime are qualified for NIBIN. And we know this through this national effort led by ATF on crime guns in the United States and firearms trafficking in the United States that was a part of a 4-volume series called the National Firearms Commerce and Trafficking Assessment. So I took part of this national effort, and we're looking at crime guns in the US over the period 2017 to 2021. And when you're working with the federal government, turns out they have a lot of data on this. So shown here are the weapon types of firearms that are recovered in crime by law enforcement and traced. So you can see here the blue line is the trend line for pistols. And you can see that about 75% of the crime guns recovered and traced in the United States were pistols. Very, very, very small amount were rifles, revolvers, or shotgun. In fact, the most commonly used crime gun in crime is a 9mm Glock. So this is, suffice it to say that NIBIN is doing a pretty good job and is pretty comprehensive under ideal conditions of capturing the types of weapons used in crime. So now that we've covered what NIBIN is, let's talk about why it matters, specifically the tactical and strategic benefits it offers gun violence reduction. And some of those probably are clear just based upon what I've shared earlier. So at the tactical level, NIBIN helps investigators connect shootings more quickly. By linking cartridge cases recovered from different crime scenes, NIBIN can show the same firearm was likely used across multiple incidents, even when those incidents occur in different neighborhoods, different days, different times. It doesn't matter. In doing so, it expands the pool of potential witnesses, suspects, and evidence by connecting incidents that might seem unrelated at first, but are connected through NIBIN. And this obviously allows investigators to piece together a broader narrative of what's happening on the ground. And this can actually improve clearance rates, right? If investigators have more information on a series of events, well, this can build stronger cases, and this can actually help identify shooters, leading to arrests. On the strategic front, the growing repository of ballistic evidence with NIBIN offers a uniquely valuable source of information on shootings. And this can enhance broader understanding of gun violence while also guiding proactive enforcement initiatives aimed toward disrupting violence. So later on, I'm going to provide some on-the-ground real-world examples on the tactical and strategic benefits of NIBIN. But to speak a little bit more on the strategic front here, NIBIN captures any time a firearm is discharged, when a firearm goes bang. So just imagine if we have every incident under ideal conditions, let's say everyone is participating in NIBIN, we can have a pretty comprehensive system of firearm usage. And that information can lead to better understanding of gun violence patterns and directing limited police resources to the places most affected by violence. So we'll put a pin on that in that for now, but we'll circle back later on. So beyond eligibility, another critical factor, as I kind of alluded to, and some of you might be thinking, is comprehensive collection. So to fully realize NIBIN's tactical and strategic potential, agencies need to collect and submit all eligible pieces of evidence into NIBIN. You can't pick and choose what goes into NIBIN. You have to be fully committed to using the system if you're a law enforcement agency. And here's why it matters. So tactically, comprehensive collection ensures that investigators have all the information on hand to link suspects across cases and remove shooters from the community before further violence occurs. Strategically, it builds a more complete map of gun violence patterns within and across jurisdictions. And this, as I mentioned before, can inform focused prevention and enforcement efforts. So without comprehensive collection, gaps appear in the network, and it just makes it harder to link shooters and link shooting events and identify the people driving violence in a community. So we can walk through an example of what this might look like. So in this example, let's consider 3 recorded shooting events, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's say these events happened on completely different days. So, but they're all used by the same firearm, okay? So if comprehensive collection is in place, meaning that the law enforcement agency, Detroit Police Department, is going to each scene and they are putting all this evidence into NIBIN. So that's the best case, right? If comprehensive collection is in place, the cartridge cases from all 3 scenes are collected and entered into NIBIN, and because of that, we get a NIBIN lead that shows us that these 3 incidences are actually connected. So these incidents are close together in time. So what's that about, right? What's going on here? What types of offenses are involved? How far apart in time are these incidents? Are they days apart, weeks apart? Is this an emerging hotspot? Should we consider deploying more patrols or outreach teams in these areas? So these are all the types of questions that you can ask if you get this information that these 3 incidents are connected. This could also be a prolific firearm. Being used by a group or an individual driving local violence. Does this, do we need to prioritize attention to this? This NIBIN lead really could just trigger a string of investigative actions and proactive decisions that help prevent future violence from unfolding. But now let's look at an example when comprehensive collection doesn't happen. So in this scenario, we have the same 3 shooting incidents, involving the same firearm, but only ballistic evidence from the first incident was ever collected and ever entered into NIBIN. So this is the first time that the firearms evidence is in the system. So we don't have any evidence connecting that firearm to incident 2 or 3. And because of that, we don't get a lead. A NIBIN lead isn't created. So from the system's perspective, incident 2 and 3 are invisible, and incident 1 appears unrelated to anything else. And really, that's a huge, it's a huge missed opportunity. So without comprehensive collection, we might assume these shootings are isolated incidents instead of connected events. We miss out on the chance to link cases, identify suspects, or understand patterns, and we lose the opportunity to recognize a potentially prolific firearm used in the community. So we're unable to ask any of those operational questions that, I mentioned before. So I'm really harping in on this because I'm kind of stealing my lead here, but later on I'll talk about how there are 10 states in the United States that have bills on the books that mandate law enforcement agencies to submit all ballistic evidence into NIBIN. And in Michigan, we don't have that bill, but there are some folks who are working on trying to make that happen. I'll talk more a little bit about that later. So we can scale this up. And when comprehensive collection doesn't happen, it's not just the local connections we miss. We miss out on state connections. We miss out on, interstate trafficking patterns. So at the state level, a firearm used in one city might later be used in another, but if evidence isn't connected, there's no evidence connecting the two because, one agency is really good at entering stuff into NIBIN and the other isn't, then we lose out the chance to see that connection. And obviously this violence can spill over into other places. They can move between cities, they can move between gangs, they can cross municipalities. At the national level, gaps in the collection mean our ability to identify interstate patterns is compromised. So for example, a gun recovered in Michigan could be used in a shooting in another state, but without NIBIN on both ends, we're going to miss that connection. So to further hit this point home, I'm returning back to that NFCTA report, the National Firearms Commerce and Trafficking Assessment. So shown here is the number of casings and test fires entered into NIBIN. This is across the country from 2017 through 2021. So you can see each year the number of both types of entries increases. Specifically in 2019 to 2020, we're seeing a really big uptick, and I'll tell you why that's happening in a second. But the point being is we're entering more stuff into NIBIN, and as a consequence, we're seeing more NIBIN leads. So shown here is the number of NIBIN leads associated with test fires and cartridge cases. And you can see big increase. So the more we're putting into NIBIN, the more information we're getting out of NIBIN in terms of NIBIN leads. And that's just one of the reasons why it's so important. This NIBIN acquisitions, putting stuff into NIBIN really does pay dividends. So the more you put in, the more leads you get, fueling investigations and violence prevention efforts. So the full potential of NIBIN is most likely to be harnessed in the context of a crime gun intelligence center or CJIC. And this is an interagency framework involving local, state, and federal partners. And among other attributes, participating CJIC sites must adhere to ATF's minimum required operating standards. And critical among these standards is a commitment to the timely and comprehensive collection of all suitable pieces of ballistic evidence into NIBIN. So if you're a CJIC site, you are making a handshake with ATF that says you need to get everything into NIBIN that is eligible for NIBIN, and you need to do that as quickly as you possibly can. So there's very strict standards. So CJICs are designed to generate actionable intelligence from firearms evidence, and they involve, as I mentioned, federal, state, and local partners to get the job done. And these include partnerships with police departments like the Detroit Police Department, ATF, prosecutors, crime labs, analysts, and academics like myself. And the whole point of CJICs is to identify shooters and disrupt cycles of gun violence more quickly than traditional means alone. So far, the Bureau of Justice Assistance has provided grant funding to set up 57 CJIC sites across the United States. And again, as I mentioned, they have to maintain those minimum required operating standards. So at least in Detroit, we can rest assured that NIBIN is very comprehensive and we're getting that information back as quickly as possible, typically within 48 hours. So behind this sort of CJIC infrastructure is something called the CJIC model, and it's a 7-step process that begins with the collection of firearms evidence and continues through NIBIN entry and correlation to generate those NIBIN leads. And these leads are then triaged and prioritized, followed up by investigators and detectives and task force, and the information is then shared with prosecutors for building cases, and the results are tracked and evaluated to measure impact. And finally, the CJIC model is very cyclical and feedback is emphasized for continuous improvement. So the power of the CJIC really rests in the comprehensive collection of NIBE, and we're getting everything in there. But in addition to that, there's a seven-step workflow process of how do we leverage these NIBE leads to result in arresting violent gun offenders. So this is the process. And again, I could probably spend an hour talking about each one of these steps, but for the for the purpose of time, suffice it to say, there's the well-oiled machine. Once those leads are generated, how they're investigated, and how those investigations turn into arrest of chronic gun offenders. And so that leads us to the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center. So as I mentioned, it became fully operational in January 2020. And before then, Detroit was participating in NIBIN, but when they collected pieces of evidence to be entered into the NIBIN system, they had to hand it over to Michigan State Police. Well, at least at that time, Michigan State Police was doing a lot of NIBIN entries for most law enforcement agencies across the state of Michigan. So you can imagine they had their hands full. And as a consequence, it would often take months for the Detroit Police Department to hear anything back in terms of, hey, do we have a NIBIN lead? So imagine months and months going back, and you're a detective assigned to a case, and you don't hear anything for 3, 4 months, and then you finally get word back, oh, well, there's a NIBIN lead. Well, the momentum has slowed down. I have a full caseload. It's not very valuable if I'm getting this lead months and months later. And on top of that, when a lead is established connecting two or more crime scene investigations, the information that connects these two crime scenes together is typically put into a report that lets the law enforcement officer know that the incidents are connected. But at the time, these reports, at least when they were produced by MSP, years and years ago, really lacked some of the most basic pieces of information. Like, for instance, where these incidents were located that are, the connected incidents, where are they located? What are the addresses? Often this basic information was lacking. And we call those reports NIBIN lead reports. So not good, right? Delays in getting the word back, their NIBIN lead is, involved. And then when you get that NIBIN lead report, it doesn't contain a lot of good, juicy information for officers to act upon. Well, these challenges and shortcomings were all overcome once they started the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center. We don't have those issues now. We get those leads back within 48 hours typically, and the information packets, the NIBIN lead packets associated with those leads contain a host of really rich, actionable information. And this is in part through the partnership that Detroit CJIC has with ATF. So here's some just quick data that you can see a big rise in the number of cartridge cases and test fires entered into NIBIN. That is shown on the figure on the bottom left-hand corner. The blue here represents cartridge cases and the red test fires. And you can see going from 2019 to 2020, huge uptick there, right? Well, that's coincides with when the CJIC became operational. And then the figure to the right there that shows an upward trend line, that is the number of NIBIN leads established per year. And again, moving from 2019 to 2020, huge increase, right? And again, that's because of the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center. And then circling back to our Detroit 2025 major crime reductions, here are some of what ATF had to report in terms of connecting the Crime Gun Intelligence Center to these reductions that we're seeing. So they've recovered a little over 6,000 crime guns. Over 5,000 cartridge cases were entered into NIBIN in 2025 alone. That's a lot. Almost 3,000 NIBIN leads were created as a consequence. Almost 600 search warrants were served. A little over 2,000 felony arrests were made, and 141 individuals were charged with a federal crime. Now, this is a part of presentation where I actually talk more about the tactical and strategic benefits that are like with on the ground real world data and examples. And now let's talk about, we're going to first talk about the tactical benefits here and just start I want to highlight illustrate the use of this ballistic evidence in cases. And you might have seen NIBIN used in portrayed in, the movies or TV shows or even through the news. And so I want to start with potentially some cases that you might know. And this one is called the Yogurt Shop Murders. There was actually, for those of you who have Netflix, there was actually a documentary series on this cold case, or once known to be a cold case. But on the 6th of December in 1991, which was a Friday, Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, they're both 17, they were closing a frozen yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, where they worked with Jennifer's sister, 15-year-old Sarah Harbison, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers was waiting for a ride. And moments before midnight, a fire at the shop drew the first responders' attention, who discovered the four girls had been bound, sexually assaulted, and murdered. The fire destroyed nearly all the evidence, save for a cartridge case that had rolled into a drain, and trace amounts of DNA included under Ayers' fingernails. The yogurt shop murders shook the city of Austin, as we can imagine, and became one of the most infamous cold cases in the country. It remained unsolved for nearly 34 years until last year. So the man linked to the murders was Robert Eugene Brasher, but he never was convicted in a court of law because he died years earlier. So the video I'm going to show captures how investigators were able to make that determination. So I'm going to play this video, and if you cannot hear the audio, let me know. There we go.
Back in probably the end of May, beginning of June, I started looking into Linda's case, just basically going through and reviewing the case file to see what new steps we could take, especially with the advancements in DNA technology and that kind of stuff. So I started looking at that case, and then on the 4th of July, we got an email from Detective Daniel Jackson with the Austin Police Department in Austin, Texas, saying that there was a potential shell casing match to incident they had that's famously known as the yogurt shop murders. So he was able to do what we call a NIBIN lead for that, where it basically says that those shell casings are the same, but we still need some further testing to confirm those. Thankfully, we were able to get up to KSP Lab the next day, and they were able to kind of give us a preemptive confirmation that those shell casings were a match. So we knew that we were headed in the right direction. We later found out through the Austin Forensic Sciences Department that those shell casings 100% matched each other. But on top of that, they were also able to identify the projectiles as being fired from the same gun as well. So we knew that we were on the complete right track at that point. And then that's where DNA Lab International in Deerfield Beach, Florida came into play. We were actually able to send the sexual assault kit that was performed on Linda during the time of her autopsy. We were able to send that down to Florida, and they were able to put rush testing on that. And within a week, we were able to get a profile that matched the DNA profile from the yogurt shop murder case.
So great national example.
Again, probably end of May, beginning of June,
Great national example of the use of NIBIN to close out a case, connected a cartridge case at the yogurt shop murders to another case where they can then combine the evidence from both cases, which ultimately led them to the offender. So, like I mentioned, I heard that the documentary series on this on Netflix is really good. So if you want to learn more about that case and how it was solved, I encourage you to watch that documentary series. But to bring this closer to home, I want to turn to a recent example here in Detroit. I think this is from November of last year, where ATF and the Detroit Police Department used NIBIN in a very similar way, and this time in a local investigative context. So we can start that.
After several shootings across Detroit in November, 2 Detroit men face a federal indictment.
Yeah, they're accused of carjacking and almost murdering ATF special agents. Alaina Rojas Castillo explains where the investigation stands.
For more than a week in early November, nearly a dozen houses and cars were shot into, leaving one person seriously injured.
just got it.
side of my shoulder, my neck, somewhere. I don't know. You have to come. Yeah, see when I get
Okay, can you listen for a second? I'm studying.
I'm gonna say conscious, man.
This 911 call is part of a nearly 30-minute critical incident community briefing released by the Detroit Police Department earlier this week. From November 5th to the 13th, special agents with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, linked 7 shootings to a suspect driving a dark-colored sport utility vehicle and similar 9mm casings left at the scenes. During their investigation, officers found surveillance video and license plate information linked to 33-year-old Terrence Davis. On November 14th, Detroit police officers tried to take Davis into custody, but he ran off. Hours later, Davis was caught on camera attempting to carjack a driver at a Citgo gas station near Livernois in Cortland before shooting at ATF agents.
DPD air units stated that this was a homicide suspect, but this was a subject wanted for 1 non-fatal shooting and 11 shots fired incidents.
After a pursuit down Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, a Michigan State police trooper conducted a pit maneuver to stop the stolen car. Davis then runs off armed, with this body camera footage showing a DPD officer catching up to him on Cass Avenue.
After
We'll pause the video there. So what does this example demonstrate? It shows that NIBIN is very powerful anchor for broader investigations. So in this case, we're using that NIBIN evidence to connect those shots fired incidents, those non-fatal shooting incident, and we're incorporating other data into it. It's essentially the connective tissue, bringing in, license camera images and cell tower data, and it's all being connected through this ability of NIBIN to connect those separate incidents together by virtue of the same firearm being used, and ultimately leading to the arrest of this suspect.
after several
But so up until this point, I've highlighted a few cases you may have seen in the news, both nationally or here locally, where now NIBIN has really helped investigators move faster. But those stories are by design. These are like snapshots. They're compelling, they matter, but they don't tell us how often these outcomes occur or under what conditions. So we broadly refer to these as success stories. You might see these in the news, being highlighted as NIBIN success story. And they're great, as I mentioned, but now we want to shift from examples to grounded empirical evidence. And for that, I won't spend too much time on it, but I did conduct a study on the impact of the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center on improving fatal and non-fatal shooting clearance rates in Detroit. So these are obviously amongst the most violent types of cases. And if NIBIN is going to have an effect, these are the types of cases we would want to turn our attention to see if they have an impact. And by clearance here, I just want to remind us that we're referring to arrests. A case is cleared in law enforcement's eyes if an arrest is made, okay? So since NIBIN's value lies in its ability to identify NIBIN leads, and NIBIN leads are central to the CJIC process, my Detroit-based study asked the following question: what impact did the Detroit CJIC have on fatal and non-fatal shooting cases involving NIBIN leads? So if CJICs are going to have an effect, then these types of cases should be the most likely to be impacted. And there's been a fair bit of work on the utility, the value of NIBIN. And a lot of it happened before this whole CJIC thing started, before CJICs became popular. And as I kind of alluded to earlier with Michigan State Police and at the time, before the CJIC, Detroit had to give all its evidence to MSP to conduct these NIBIN leads. Well, that was kind of what was happening before CJICs came on the scene. We're having huge issues with getting that data back quickly, getting that information back quickly, having really good NIBIN lead reports. Just wasn't happening. But as I mentioned, CJICs really changed all this, and we don't have those issues now. So we should expect to see with the CJIC major improvements in the clearance rates for fatal and non-fatal shooting cases involving NIBIN leads. And suffice it to say, I did this research. I won't go into many of the details, but I observed that huge, major increases in clearance rates for fatal and non-fatal shootings during the CJIC. So connecting the CJIC to these major improvements in closing cases and making arrests. And this is amid a national decline in clearance rates for violent crime, particularly for gun homicides. So I don't know if some of you knew this, but clearance rate decline is a real thing. The homicide clearance rate has drastically declined going back to the 1960s. So in 1962, the homicide clearance rate was 92%, meaning that for 92% of homicides, there was an arrest. As of 2020, which is the most recent data I have on the slide, that clearance rate has fallen to 54%, which is shocking, right? So I'm just mentioning this just to underscore the huge value of this Detroit CJIC. We're seeing major improvements with closing out these fatal and non-fatal shootings, tying it back to the CJIC. And when we arrest people and incapacitate these chronic gun offenders, we also hope to see a reduction in gun violence because a small number of individuals are responsible for the vast majority of crime. So if we're able to target these individuals through arrests, improving those in clearance rates, we should expect to see also a reduction in crime. And now, really quickly, because we're almost coming to the end of time, let's talk about the strategic impacts of NIBIN. So when firearm movement into violence is assessed, time to crime, as I mentioned earlier, is often used to measure the interval between a firearms retail sale and its recovery by law enforcement. And as I mentioned, this metric is really informative, but firearms can be used in crime before their date of recovery. And so if we know that they're being used in crime before they're recovered by law enforcement, then we want to know that date. That date would give us a better indication if a firearm was trafficked. And that is what NIBIN is able to afford us. If a recovered firearm has a NIBIN lead, then we can swap out the date that the firearm was recovered and use the date that the firearm was first used in crime. And this provides a better, more accurate metric of firearms trafficking. We refer this to time to first shooting or in comparison to time to crime. So to further hit this value home of why time to first shooting is important, here I'm going to pull up again some data from the National Firearms Trafficking Assessment. So this shows us the top 10 states that have submitted evidence into the firearms tracing system, Michigan being one of them, and it calculates the median time to crime and median time to first shooting. So in all cases, time to first shooting should be shorter from time to crime. But where it really kind of matters is that if time to crime is over 3 years, which remember 3 years is our metric for our benchmark for an indicator of firearms trafficking, but time to first shooting is under 3 years, then that tells us if we don't use time to first shooting as a metric for firearms trafficking, then some firearms might slip through the cracks. And some firearm trafficking might go unaddressed if we don't turn to time to first shooting. And this is really shown here by Florida. Let's see if I can use my little laser pointer here. Florida, their median time to crime is over 3 years, but their median time to first shooting is under 3 years, indicating the value of using this time to first shooting metric to identify firearms trafficking. And if we don't do that, then some crime guns might slip through the cracks and we might think falsely that they weren't trafficked when they probably were. Another way we can use this data is to identify something called near repeat shootings. And near repeat shootings is this tendency for shootings to concentrate very closely in time and place. That one shooting triggers a next shooting happening very closely to it. And I did some research in Detroit to find that we found this phenomenon happening in Detroit. In fact, when a shooting incident occurred, there is an increased likelihood that another will occur within 2 weeks in 2 blocks. And so with that information, we're able to give that to law enforcement to direct where they assign officers for patrol. So if an incident occurred on Friday, then okay, we should probably get some officers to patrol the area around the incident to potentially prevent another one from happening, right? And so the image I previously shown just shows two shootings, but this can kind of have a domino effect. This effect can involve a chain of shootings all connected within a short period of time in a short place. So as I mentioned, this is really good information for law enforcement to know to direct their resources. And this is something I've been working with Detroit Police Department on doing. But also we kind of want to know what are some underlying environmental issues in these areas that might be generating crime. There are things known as crime generators and detractors. These are places, without getting into the minutia, that might, for one reason or another, attract crime or be good places for crime to occur, like gas stations, bus stops, liquor stores, abandoned homes. So we might want to use these patterns we're seeing to drill down into those areas to target these places that might be part of these patterns that we're seeing. We also can use data in NIBIN to identify hotspots of gunfire because every cartridge case entered into NIBIN represents an incident where a fire went bang. So we can create these maps and deploy them to different precincts to direct the proactive enforcement initiatives, to direct initiatives aimed at reducing the violence in those areas. So this map is made up, but I do work with the Detroit Police Department to create real maps that they deploy to precinct command and special task force to drill down into those places where gun violence is concentrated the most. And so, for the interest of time, I'll just kind of briefly go over this slide. But this slide is showing here some, for those of you who might be interested in kind of tracking more closely gun violence in your neighborhood or just statewide or nationally, every town has come out with this data source called Every Shot Data, and it's publicly available data set that tracks gun violence incidents across the country using open source data like media reports, police releases, and public records. So for the interest of time, I was going to walk through an example of how you can use this, but we're coming closely on time, so I'll skip over. But to kind of wrap things up, the CJIC model has been shown to be very successful in Detroit, yielding both clear tactical and strategic benefits. And at a broader scale, NIBIN has great potential at the state level. We can look at patterns of gun violence, identify firearms trafficking. And as I alluded to earlier, there are 10 states, which I listed here, that have those CJIC bills that allow us to work more comprehensively with the data because all law enforcement agencies within these states are required to submit their evidence into NIBIN. So Detroit's experience, really just shows us what's possible with crime gun intelligence. And I think it's, amazing what the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence Center has achieved. And I think it's one of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the strongest evidence-based initiatives they have right now in the Detroit Police Department. So thank you so much. I'm going to end the presentation here and stop sharing my screen. And I guess I'll open it up for questions. I probably have like 5 minutes for questions because I have a 2 o'clock. But
So,
for those of you who I don't get to a question, you can feel free to email me and I'm happy to answer over email.
Wonderful. So if anybody has a quick question, please unmute yourself. Oh, there's one from Pam Ford. Let me see if I can pull that up again. Chat here. Let's see. How many CJICs are in Michigan?
So there's one formal CJIC site, which is the Detroit Crime Gun Intelligence, which is funded by the Bureau, was started by funds from the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Every year, prior to a year or more ago, there was a grant solicitation released by BJA to apply for CJIC funding. However, as of like a year and a half ago, there are no more opportunities for those funds. I hope that we'll see those opportunities in the future because there are more law enforcement agencies and organizations that would like to establish the CJIC, but need that critical funding to do so.
Real quick, James Wendell, his audio is not working. He has a question. Is the science related to testing cartridges based on solid research?
Yes, I would say so. So it's not my area of expertise, but there's a whole arm of forensic science that is like really gets into the weeds with like those high confidence correlations. Like what markings on the cartridge case are the ones that we need to be the most concerned about in terms of creating those links. So I'm only like I have one arm away from that type of research because it's just not in my area. But on the ATF website, they say that they're at least a 98% positive just through that process. that those links are accurate. So there's a distinction between a NIBIN lead and a NIBIN hit. A NIBIN lead is like preliminary. It's those high correlation matches, which are reviewed by a NIBIN technician. But if we want to use that information to present in a court of law, then a certified firearms examiner has to sit down and examine those cartridge cases from the different crime scenes underneath a microscope to confirm those NIBIN leads. So the NIBIN leads are really kind of investigative leads, and the NIBIN hits are what are used in the court of law. But sorry, I should know the forensic science more, but I know from people who work in that field that there is a very extensive science around it.
Wonderful. So Dee Dee Ford, she's a retired felony prosecutor. She appreciates this presentation. Thanks you very much. And then her, let's see, thank you so much. Great work. From Pam Ford. Oh, she has a question. Are all NIBIN hits reviewed by a human based on
Yeah.
evidence of AI? Okay, that's a yes.
Yeah, they are. The NIBIN hits are. The NIBIN leads have that NIBIN technician that just looks at the correlation numbers, but their eyes are not on the actual cartridge cases themselves. But for the hits that have to be confirmed for law, they do involve a human. Now, I don't know. We're living in weird times with AI, so I don't know what the plans are for that. But as of right now, a human has to look at those NIBIN hits.
Okay, so real quick, will revolvers become the crime weapon of choice as NIBIN needs expended cartridges?
Oh, that's a good
So
question. I hope not.
here's a twist.
Yeah, so I am one of my mentors, Pete Gagliardi. He's former ATF and he's a big proponent of NIBIN, very well known in the field. He is really focused on bringing ATF back to have the capacity for NIBIN to submit bullets into NIBIN. NIBIN has that functionality, that science that used to identify those NIBIN leads can involve bullets. It's just something we're not currently doing very often in the field. Um, Brazil, and a matter of fact, their crime gun of choice in Brazil is revolvers,
Wow.
which is wild. So their capacity that they're building out for NIBIN is focused a lot on bullets. We have that capacity, we just don't use it. So my, colleague and mentor would love to see NIBIN being used a lot for bullets as well.
Wow. I saw a hand up from Patience. Are you still with us, Patience? If not,
I
it's too
I
open.
am, but
Oh,
I do know she has to go. Um, I don't know if we have time for this last question, but I was just curious about like the CJIC and the impetus in getting it started. In the map you showed, there was like none in the Northwest, and I just wonder like how does that get started, and will we see more pop up?
yeah, so the map, oh, the Northwest. Yeah, I hope we see more pop up. Unfortunately, the funding within the last like year or two has been restricted. If you go to the Bureau of Justice Assistance website and even like the DOJ and you type in grant funding, you'll see check back later. Well, it's been like that for a while now. So I'm hopeful that we'll see that return of funding and folks applying to get that funding so they can start their CJIC. But you can see that the CJIC sites that we have now tend to be concentrated in those cities and places where there's a lot of gun violence.
Well, wonderful. This is so informative. I really appreciate the study that you did because all the questions I jotted down, you actually answered in your slide presentation.
Oh, great.
So all the data is kind of, there's a lot of data, but then you kind of explained it in your slides, which I appreciate very much. So I'd like to thank you for being with us today. I know you have to go, and hopefully there'll be another topic that you could bring to us, and maybe we can enjoy another presentation on Zoom with you.
Yeah, I'd love it. And yeah, if anyone has any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Feel free to share my email.
I will share your email if anybody requests that for more questions. And thank you so much, Alaina. We
Oh,
appreciate
my
it.
pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, that was a great program. And whoever's left, just know that you will have a survey coming to your email. Just let me know what you think. And if I have your email, I'll look for our newsletter also. I'll send those out. Excuse me, Carol sends those out once a week, and you'll get updated on all things Scott Club from the newsletter. So thank you all. Have a great day and stay warm. Bye-bye. I got you, Rosalind. Thanks. All right.